Greetings. This is episode 1 of my engineering Oddcast. The subject this week is interviews, how to be interviewed specifically, but actually much of the advice will cover if you are an interviewer. Let's start with what's the purpose of the interview. The interview is how the hiring company is going to judge whether they want to hire you or not, and it's also the process that will help you as the person being hired decide if you want to work at that company or not. Both those stakes exist. They're real. Like, you really do have to decide if you want to work there as part of the process, as much as they have to decide if they want to hire you. So, don't forget that in your thinking. It's important to remember that both of those sides exist, because if you view it as merely the company has some jobs to give out and they want, they're going to try and knock you down and view it in this kind of adversarial way, that will put you in a pretty difficult mindset to be performing at your best in an interview situation. So you try to remember that you have an equal amount of agency in the interview process. Let's also talk about what the purpose of the interview questions are. You'll typically be asked two kinds of questions. In broad categories, these are like how you interact with people and how you are technically. So let's cover the people side of things first. You're going to be asked about your career so far, perhaps about your aspirations. Often, despite it being quite a bad question, you'll be asked why you want to work at this company, and we'll talk about how you can respond to those. You'll also be asked what for many people is the most difficult question in the interview, which is, have you got any questions for me? And we'll talk about what you should be preparing before you get to that point. On the technical side, there's many categories of questions. Some people call them problem-solving questions. Some companies do system design interviews. Some companies do algorithms interviews and various other kinds of little puzzles, either drawn from real life or created for the purpose of interviews. These questions are there to gauge how you think, and that has some very important consequences, which, unless you've done interview training at an interviewing company, you won't understand how best to prepare for them, and you won't necessarily you wouldn't infer what's the right way to go about practicing for those. I want to take you through how you can best communicate how you think to the interviewer, so that and why that will give you the maximum chance of getting the job. If you're being interviewed by very good interviewers, they will ask each question with a purpose of gathering some specific piece of information. And while there will be some overlap between the questions different interviewers ask, if you're interviewed by 4 or 5 different people, there'll be some overlap points so that they can get multiple views on one part of your personality or your technical ability. They will also not be completely overlapping. They're trying to gather different disjoint bits of it, or partially overlapping bits of information, ideally, so that when they get together at the end of the interview process, they are able to say, okay, this candidate is this good compared to the field on some things and this good compared to the field on some other thing. You don't want any one of your interviewers to be in the position of saying, I could not get the information about this aspect of their personality, because that gets treated as you are the worst. What that means, like in practical terms, is however bad you think you are at some aspect of interviewing or technicality, it's better to let the interviewer find that out than it is to try and conceal it from them. And that has a very important effect on how you should prepare for technical interview questions. When you're asked a technical interview question, it's to see how you think. And if you have already seen that problem before and thought about it, when I ask you that technical interview question, I, as an interviewer, now cannot get any information about how you really think about that problem. People who interview can tell when someone has seen the problem before, typically. You want to minimize your exposure to problems that are likely to be asked in interview situations, which is not so tough because mostly they're made up. I've seen a lot of people ask on sites like Stack Overflow and so forth, like, how should I solve this interview question, or where's a good list of interview questions so I can prepare? That's possibly the worst thing you can do, because if you imagine a scenario where you have successfully prepared for every technical interview question under the sun. No technical interviewer now can possibly get information on how you think when answering a technical interview question. Therefore, you rank at the bottom every time anyone asks that, and you can't get a job. What it's productive to do, instead of practicing how to solve these specific interview questions that you might be asked, practice with a friend or by recording yourself to camera and then playing it back, solving a problem of like a technical problem or a system design problem or whatever class of problem it is that you think you might have the most difficulty with, and explaining step by step how it is you're thinking as you go. I would do the first few rounds of this practice with yourself and a video camera, and then for the last few rounds of it, maybe enlist the help of a friend who is technical but doesn't necessarily know the problem that you're trying to solve, and validate that you can get on a video call with them, explain how you're thinking as you go through it, and that they understand what your process is to solve it. What we most want as interviewers is to understand how you think about a problem, but we can't get inside your brain. We have to rely on what it is you say you're thinking about the problem. So by practicing solving a problem that you're not going to see in an interview, but thinking about how you're going to communicate that to someone else, and validating that the other person received that information, you're giving yourself the best chance of communicating to the real interviewer, this is how I think. The worst that can happen if you accurately communicate how you think is that the interviewer has an exactly accurate idea of how good you are on that bit of technical skill. Their error bars on that will be really narrow and they'll know it. Say that you're at the 50th percentile in terms of how good you think about a certain class of problems, and the interviewer has correctly in their mind established that, but also because of how well you communicated, they've established that you're like between the 45th and 55th percentiles. You're then in a very good place at the end of the interview cycle when the interviewers can say, we think they're this good and we're very sure of it. That beats out someone who has been weaker at communicating, so like maybe they're this good, better than you, but the error margins are so wide that their worst case possibility is worse than yours. More likely that you'll get hired to the job you deserve the better you communicate. There's another reason to communicate in great detail how you're solving problems, and that is we do occasionally as interviewers see people who are cheating, or at least that we strongly suspect are cheating. And what cheating looks like is we ask the question, there's silence or nothing's happening. The interviewee's eyes are elsewhere, not looking at the window where we're asking the question, so far as we can tell, and then they type in the correct answer. If that's how you behave in an interview, I will assume that what you've done is let someone else hear the question as I asked it and see your screen perhaps, and then they've given you the answer and you've typed it in from another window. If I think that, you are not getting the job. There's just no way. As an interviewer, I have to make the decision on the information that I have available, and when I see that behavior that I suspect I've been really getting the technical answers to these questions from someone other than the person I'm interviewing, that's like a fraudulent behavior. I have no information about how good this candidate themselves actually is. That's an instant strike. There's no way that you get through, that candidate gets through the end of hiring loop and gets hired. The reason I'm telling you all this is because I know that there are people who, if you asked a question, want to think about it in relative silence for a bit, and they want to send their eyes away and look at something in the middle distance because that's their natural reaction to thinking about a problem. Very important that you have practiced not doing that in an interview situation, because that and what happens if you're cheating look exactly the same to the person on the other end of the VC. Make sure that on the video that the interviewer is going to see, that you appear to be as engaged with the problem as you actually are. Let's talk about where you can get suitable problems to try and solve for algorithms and data structures and that kind of problem-solving puzzle that you may be asked in interviews. I personally like to get them from the puzzle pages of a newspaper. Sudoku was a popular thing in the UK, still is. You can write a program to solve Sudoku. It's very easy to do a basic one. There's quite a lot of different algorithms you can explore for solving it. You can go to the system design end of like, how am I going to balance which algorithm to use when in some kind of cost function. There's quite a lot of depth there, and it's also very handy because there's no shortage of test cases. You can find puzzles on the internet, you can find puzzles by buying a book of Sudokus. If that one doesn't float your boat, or if you've solved it and you still want more practice, go on to another one. Like all of these logic games that you get in newspapers are amenable to computer solutions, and in general they're quite good practice at algorithms. Wordle's quite interesting to write a solver for. If you want to practice the more kind of policy oriented and system design questions that are going to be more common as you are more of a senior engineer, it can be quite interesting to revisit the design decisions that were involved in the design of your favorite or one of your favorite computer programming languages. For example, the C and C++ integer maths don't work exactly the same way as the underlying hardware integer maths do, and you can explore what are the pros and cons of making that trade-off. Like, would a world in which they do work the same as the underlying hardware be better or be worse, and why? Very much do not go to the lengths of mailing the C++ standards committee about this. The decision's been made. It's set in stone. It's not going to change. But if you force yourself to think about that decision, what would the world be like if they'd gone the other way? Would that help you in some cases? Would it not? In order to do that, you will have to understand so much stuff and communicate so well that it will be excellent practice for any like low-level system design things that you come across in the future. If you're more into designing applications than low-level infrastructure, you can find an application that you are somewhat familiar with and start, picking it at bits of it, like, why is this like that, instead of like another choice. And right, again, you should practice explaining what the trade-off is, why it matters, and perhaps practice advocating for the other path. Again, like, don't email the product designers and yell at them. It's not cool. This is just for your edification, to find choices other people have made and try to understand them by exploring the other choice they could have made. I want to give another tip specifically about system design questions while it's in my mind. There are a couple of broad approaches that I know interviewers have. So some interviewers would like to ask a relatively underdefined system design question with the expectation that you will ask for clarifying information, and that will teach them something about how you think, something about how you collaborate with other people. It's interesting to ask questions in that way because you get some understanding of what is it that the interviewee is going to assume is required versus what are they going to ask about versus what's, so it lets you understand what they think is a fixture that everyone would assume is there versus what is the detail of this scenario. The other kind of system design interview that you may get asked is one that starts almost totally specified or even totally specified and very simple. And if you misidentify that kind of problem as though it's the first kind of problem, you're going to waste a lot of time trying to find, like, what is there that I should be thinking about. One of the big hints you're in that scenario is that the interviewer asks you, I want to see the minimum viable design so we can start evaluating whether we even want to do this at all. If that's anything like those phrases is used by the interviewer, you need to be drawing a very, very, very simple design, and they're going to add extension questions to explore, other scenarios. If you're not sure which of those you're in, and you were to ask me which of those situations am I in, I'm going to give you a straight answer. What I'm saying is that the interview is not actually there trying to catch you out. If you are stuck on something or whatever, let the interviewer know. Believe me, we're going to know that you're stuck somewhere or suspect it anyway. If you tell us, then that tells the interviewer that you're self-aware enough to know that you're stuck and that you need help when you need it. Every candidate in some point in the interview cycle is going to get stuck or answer a question wrong. How it is. But those who are self-aware enough to realise it in the moment have an advantage over those who are not. Given two people who both got stuck and one of them asked for help, I'd prefer the second one, because I know they're not going to sit there for 3 weeks achieving nothing because they're stuck. They're going to ask for help. I've seen them do it. Whereas the other candidate, I do not know that because they didn't do it in the interview. That's all I want to say about the technical questions. If you have other things you want clarified, please ask in the comments. Let's talk about the questions you might be asked in the personal interaction section of the interview. You might be asked to describe a situation where there was some kind of conflict between, like a disagreement between yourselves and your co-workers, anything kind of like that. They're not looking for a way to trip you up, they're just looking for some kind of story of what happened and how you dealt with it. If you're asked how you dealt with a conflict with your colleagues and you genuinely have never disagreed with your colleagues, you have to say that. You can't make something up that doesn't exist. But be aware that for many companies, or particularly the ones who want to assess that trait, that will put you at the bottom of the pile, because as we spoke of earlier, if they can't gather the information, the assumption is that you get treated as though you are the worst possible performer on that dimension, and then you can usually assume you will not get the job. I don't have any super helpful advice actually about the personality questions, other than answer them honestly. As you do a few interviews, you're going to get a feel for what they are. I think it's reasonably safe for you to look on the internet at what the kind of common personality type questions are. When we ask those questions, we're not assessing how you think about being asked this question, we're assessing what your response to that scenario is. And so there's no harm in knowing what the questions are and having a think about, like, what's my most representative response to such a situation. Ultimately, those of us who've been interviewed several times have been asked all of these personality profiling questions many times, and will probably have given basically the same answer or talked about the same situation, at least in response to them. And I think that's expected and priced into the nature of the questions, unlike with technical questions where they become valueless if you've seen them before. The personality questions possibly even become more valuable if you've thought about the answer a bit longer. So let's talk about the couple of difficult questions. So you may be asked, so why do you want to work here? I don't like that question because it puts myself and the hiring company or the interviewer back in that like adversarial nature of they're giving out work, I need work, and it sort of disavows that I have agency still left. Like, it pretends that I don't have to decide anymore if I want the job. Assumes I've already decided that, and now it's about, can I have it? Which is not typically the case when I'm in an interview. I'm still at that point deciding, do I want to work at this company? Like, will I accept the offer if they offer me a job? My tactic with this question is to answer a related but different question that reestablishes that I still have agency. I will answer the question, why did I agree to do this interview loop, or why did I apply to this job? Typically, the interview loop is my first chance to encounter the people who work at that company in some kind of realistic setting, like who my peers will be, who my manager will be. I don't have a way to find out about them and how they behave towards me before the interview loop. That is an important part of how I decide if I want this job or not. The other question that seems to cause a lot of trouble with people is, do you have any questions for me, when the interviewer asks that. If the interviewer's done their job well, they will typically be asking you this question with about 10, 15 minutes to go in the scheduled interview. So you may feel some pressure to come up with some really great questions. What I like to do is think about what I need to know in order to be sure that I want this job. I won't even necessarily do the work of converting those into questions. When the interviewer says, have you got any questions for me? I'll say, I'd like to understand what your meeting load is like, or what your on-call schedule is like, or how often are you called out in the middle of the night, or whatever it is that's important to me. One other specific question that served me well, a few times in my career I've switched from one industry to another, and I've found it useful to ask, as a person new to this industry, what should I be asking about that I haven't asked about? It's best to direct that question to more senior people who have perhaps done a bunch more interviews of candidates. It's fair to pitch that question to a manager or team leader or anyone else who's senior in the organisation. Let's talk about preparing for the interview outside of answering the questions. One of the things I like to do in the interview situation is I recognise that it's stressful for me to be interviewed. It's also actually relatively similarly stressful to be an interviewer, so this is the part that basically applies both ways. I like to be as sure as I can that there's not going to be any surprises during the interview other than what happens because of the interview conversation. So I don't want any technical surprises, I don't want any weird noises happening, I don't want any weird visual effects happening, I don't want to be super hungry, I don't want to be too thirsty. I recognise that I can control basically all of those things, and so I'm going to, right? Practically what that means is when I'm scheduling interviews, I will not accept back-to-back interviews. I will say I need a 15-minute break between one interview and the next, and I'm going to use that time to go to the bathroom, to clear my head from the previous interview and reset, perhaps eat a snack bar if I'm low on blood sugar, which is, thinking in interview terms is pretty cognitively draining, and you do need to fuel it to some extent. I aim to do that between interviews rather than during, because it's offensive to some people to see someone else eating, or because of politeness you want to cover your mouth, and that will mean you can't be talking and communicating how you're thinking. I will, however, need to drink during interviews, because talking a lot makes your voice start to go weird. As you can probably tell, I haven't been drinking enough during this Oddcast. Let me just claim, even though it's not true, that was so that you can hear what happens to a degraded voice. It becomes a bit distracting to the person listening. You can hear that my voice is stressed and not at its peak condition. It's also pretty distracting to me. I'm now thinking about drinking something instead of thinking about what I'm talking about. So for an interview, I will have a bottle of water, always a bottle, not an open container, because I don't want the stress of thinking, am I going to splash this all over my keyboard? That is also why I need those 15 minutes between interviews, because having drunk enough to not sound like this, I will need to pee. I want to use all of the scheduled interviewing time for interviewing. I'm not going to give up my 10 minutes of finding out about the company and the role. Let's also talk about other technologies and technical surprises that you can manage. I find it off-putting if I'm in a video call with someone and their audio sounds weird. In an interview situation, if my audio sounds weird to the candidate or vice versa, we're going to waste a lot of time asking each other to repeat what was just said. And as we get back to the point of the interview from both sides, is to gather information about how the other side thinks and works. And if we're spending all our time asking each other to repeat ourselves, we're just getting worse and worse quality of information about the other things. In an A/B comparison between a candidate and the same candidate with terrible audio on the interview call, we're going to hire the first candidate, not the one with bad audio. Even if they're objectively, if measured fairly, exactly the same, because we will know much more accurately what the first candidate is, that's the one that will get hired. If you've got choices, and most people will have choices about how the audio works on their video call, arrange with a friend to call them on the same platform that's going to be used for the interview. Check out the options that you've got and have your friend tell you which one sounds the best. In the event of a tie, or even if it's slightly worse but the result is close, I would say favour a solution, which is a wired microphone rather than wireless, because anything wireless, as its battery drains, will start to drop out or degrade in quality, and local electromagnetic interference is typically has a worse effect on wireless devices than wired ones. The other equally important thing is video. Again, you should test this with a friend, but on the same platform that the interview is going to be conducted over. Try and make sure that your camera is set up so that when you're paying attention to the interviewing window, it looks like that's what you're paying attention to, which means basically put your camera just above the window where you're going to be typing in the answers, or the window with the shared whiteboard, or the window with the interviewer's face on. Don't use multiple monitors for this and start working on another monitor, because while that may be how you normally work and it may be how you work most efficiently, what it conveys to the interviewer is that you're not paying attention to the interview process and possibly you're cheating. So it's just a bad risk. That's what I'll say. For the purpose of interviewing, train yourself to do everything on that one screen underneath the video camera. The other important thing the thing I like to do that I feel helps is I wear block colors if I'm going to be doing a lot of or any amount of VCing. If you wear striped or patterned tops, that can sometimes cause a strobe-like effect due to the moire interference patterns. It's all very fun to look up on Wikipedia, and the maths is quite interesting, but it is very distracting and potentially seizure-inducing for the other end, if other person in the call, if you have that effect going on. I mistakenly did a VC one time where I was wearing a striped shirt, and for everyone else apparently it was fine, but my self-view was strobing like anything and giving me a headache. So final word on videos, as a very pale person, if I set up a video system with a dark wall behind me and I'm wearing a dark t-shirt, what will happen is the camera will assume that the dark background and my shirt needs to be increased in brightness, and it will make my face look completely washed out. People with dark skin have exactly the opposite problem. If they wear white tops and stand in front of a white wall, then their face almost disappears into blackness. The other thing to be aware of is cheap cameras will automatically balance the color to make what they think is white look white, which means if you stand in front of a wall that's predominantly green, your face will appear more red than it usually does. If you stand in front of a wall that's a bit tinted red, your face will appear greener than it really is, and either of those can look weird. On the green tinted face looks weirdest of all. You can test yourself by recording yourself with the camera in the situation and with the clothes that you're going to be wearing. The best is to do that same test and check with a friend who's using the same video platform as your interview is going to be done on, just to make sure that nothing weird happens that causes you to look unnatural. It's important to look natural for, let's say, 3 reasons. One is it's a bit distracting if the person you're interviewing looks green or purple, both of which I've had. You can muddle through it as an interviewer, but it's something in the back of your mind, and that's stopping you focusing on the rest of their performance. And as we've said, anything that takes away from your ability to measure their performance fairly is bad for the candidate. Secondly, in this age of AI, people are becoming a bit concerned about whether a large language model and something like DALL-E and a voice synthesizer could be wired together to take the interview for you. If you look sort of freakish and computer generated, then people might suspect that they're being tested on such a system, even though it's much more likely that that's not the case. The third reason is that as humans, we're pretty much hardwired to interpret people's facial expressions and to gain an understanding of the other person through that. If you've managed to light yourself as naturally as possible, so that on the video call you look how you really look, the interviewer will understand that, like, just because of how human brains work, and they'll get a fairer reading and perhaps even be more sympathetic generally to you, versus if you don't look natural or you're so over or underexposed that they can't make out what your face is doing at all. That's going to prevent that from happening, and that can only disadvantage you as a candidate. Let's also talk about where you should have interviews. So I've spoken in the rest of this episode as though interviewing is a thing that happens on video conferencing systems, and for technical interviews that over the last 10 years, basically the first interview has always been a video call or perhaps even a straight phone call. The second interview is usually the same, and then the third, the final round of interviews has varied between being on site and being a block of interviews that are done on video conferencing. Obviously during COVID everything was video conferencing all the time, and now that COVID's starting to unwind, for those companies that have stopped being primarily remote, you're starting to see candidates being given a choice between being on site or doing the interview remotely. My advice to you as a candidate is if the job you're considering is an on-site role, so you're expected to be in the office to do the job, should you take the job, you should do the final round of interviews on-site. Not for their benefit or for any tactical reason, but because you do need to collect the information for yourself to make the decision of do you want the job, about what the job's going to be like. Any company that's asking for the role to be on-site should expect to offer, or at least expect to be asked if they don't offer, on-site final in. So I have one more topic to cover on the subject of preparing for VC type interviews. When you are invited to do an interview on video conferencing, technical interview, typically they're going to use a coding platform like CoderPad, or there's several others. You just Google alternatives to CoderPad, they'll all come up. Typically you'll find out which one they're going to use in advance. If you don't, then find out what the top 5 are and have a look at all of them. They all have their own quirks, they have their own kind of way of working. It's better for you as a candidate if your first experience of that platform is not in an interview where it matters for real. And all of the ones that I've encountered have some kind of practice mode where you can go in and do some sample question. But don't worry, no one's using those sample questions for real interview questions. You're not going to lose anything, and you can get a feel for the environment and how it works. Be sure to check out how your language works specifically in that environment, because it can have very different quirks, or be ancient or be more modern than what you're perhaps used to. If you're at a company that's hiring engineers, and statistically speaking, if you've got a job as an engineer somewhere, you are, certainly consider doing the interviewer training, joining the interviewing panels, and going through life on the other side of the interview desk for a while. It will give you an understanding of what behaviours you see good and bad candidates doing. You'll be able to learn from their mistakes, and you'll be able to learn from what other people say in the interview debriefs, what you can do for yourself better in the future. My final note for this episode is I've done this Oddcast for interviewing first because it's one thing you typically can't ask anyone at your current company about, is how do I get better at being interviewed for jobs. If you're a junior engineer or early in your career and working at a company with other software engineers, it's typically written into more senior software engineers' job descriptions that they're there to help develop your career. So if you have questions about software engineering and your behavior that are within the scope of doing the job you've already got, please start with them. I will do an episode later on how to best ask for help and what you can expect. But do remember that going out onto the internet and listening to people who you have no relationship to talking about stuff on some podcast is not your only place to get information. You've got colleagues. If you're a recent graduate, you've got friends from your class who will know you personally, who will have a much better view of your strengths and weaknesses and where you can do better. And while it's perhaps weird initially for you to go to someone and say, look, I know I have a problem, or I feel like I have a problem with this aspect of my engineering work, you know, do you agree? Can you help me? Give me any pointers? That is generally seen as a very good thing to do. When I've had that conversation with other senior engineers on either side, I feel like it's only ever deepened the respect we have for each other. If I'm asking another senior engineer, like, I feel like I got this situation wrong, what would you have done? How would you have handled it? Because I think I did it terribly. It's telling them that I respect them. It's also conveying to them that I'm self-aware enough to have felt that I know I got that wrong. Those are never bad things to communicate to someone. All that said, because I recognise that you can't typically ask people where you work for interview advice, I will be looking at the comments on this episode to establish if there are other things where I can helpfully answer the questions people have. And I also recognise that there's people who are working in software engineering who are the only engineer and who don't have a pool of great colleagues such as I've been privileged to have. If you are in that situation, ask questions in comments below. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in episode 3.